Hey, what's going on? So this is going to be a hopefully fairly short video on Illustrator and using patterns. We'll cover a couple of things like clipping masks and color setups, and then make something in Illustrator. Now this is going to be using what's called a bezeled effect, where essentially you change one color in a pattern and it really changes the look and feel of that. I'm going to start by just opening a new file. So I'm going to go to File, New. And this is going to be A3. You can find that preset under Print. So I'll go to Print, View All Presets, set it as A3. I prefer to see this in millimeters instead of points. And we can go ahead and click Create. Now I am planning on doing this for print. And just for some setup, it is always good to know the factors of the dimensions of the document that you're using. And A3, the factors, you kind of have to round up one number, but the closest factors are going to be like 60 millimeters, 30 millimeters, 20 millimeters, 15, and 5, and 2. That's going to kind of dictate how big you want to make your pattern tiles, if you want to make sure that it doesn't kind of fall off the edge. If you're not worried about it falling off the edge, then you can make it whatever size you want, but I wanted to kind of fill this A3 paper. When you open Illustrator, it probably looks like this, which I find not particularly helpful. So we are going to go up to Window, and we're going to go to Workspace, and go to Essentials Classic. I'm going to collapse this stuff because I don't really need that. I do need the stuff over here. So if you haven't used Illustrator before, you can use these little buttons to collapse and open things. There's another panel I'm also going to need, which is the Pathfinder panel. So you can find more of these panels like this on the window menu. And the one I want right here is Pathfinder. So open up here. And we can dock these panels if we want to. I'm just going to leave this one kind of floating around because it's a little bit easier to deal with kind of floating around like this. I'm going to go ahead and start making some shapes here, but I do want to go ahead and turn off this fill. So we've got a fill and a stroke, and I'm going to just turn off the fill because it makes it a little bit easier to see the shapes as we're building. Now there are a lot of different ways that you can go about building your pattern. My favorite is to use primitive shapes and kind of build it up from that. So you can start with like a polygon tool. You can click out a polygon, hold Shift to make sure it stays upright. You can hold or press the up and down arrow keys to add or subtract sides. And it does drag this out from the center, so I can hold Shift to make sure it just kind of drags out from the center like that. It's always good and a little bit easier to work from the origin, which the origin is going to be the center of the document here. So if we go to Align, which should actually open with Pathfinder, we can actually make sure that this is set to align to the artboard. And then we can align horizontal, align vertical. If you don't see this align to thing, sometimes Illustrator, depending on your screen size, might start with these collapsed. So each one of these panels has a number of states. Open, collapsed, and then kind of like fully open with all the options. Now we could do this with shapes. So I could take shapes here like this triangle, and let's maybe add a circle to it. And we can essentially just use our shapes and kind of put them together and combine them with the Pathfinder panel. So we can put our circle and our triangle here. And a quick way to just make sure that they're aligned is to use this Align Center. Now one thing to watch out for though here is that the center of the circle is in the center of its bounding box, whereas the center of the triangle is not the center of the bounding box. When you try to center these things, they're going to line up in a weird way. They're no longer, they don't appear to be centered because they're lining up by bounding box and not by the center of that triangle. The triangle is one of the shapes that doesn't actually, the bounding box and the triangle itself don't share the same center, so it's a little bit off. So you do need to kind of tweak it just a little bit if you want to use that. Now, a lot of different things that we can do with these shapes involve Pathfinder. In Pathfinder, we can essentially just take a couple of shapes and take Pathfinder. We can unite them, so it'll make one shape out of two. We can minus front, And that'll take whichever shape is on top here in our layer stack, which in this case is the ellipse, and we'll minus that. We can put the polygon on top and then do minus front again, and it will give us a different effect. We can do overlap, which will keep just the areas where those shapes overlap. We can do this one here, which will basically get rid of any areas where they overlap. If you do try these out, make sure to undo and Control Z so that you get back to the state right here, because otherwise if I click on that and don't do that, you'll notice here it's in a group. I won't be able to try any of the others. It's going to tell me that nothing is happening, or the filter produced no results because they're already divided. So you just want to be aware of that. Now, again, there are a lot of different things that we can do with this. And Illustrator, working with primitive shapes like this and just kind of doing Boolean operations will give you lots of different things. So we can take this and flip it upside down. I'm going to do Control C, Control F. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you do Control V, it's going to paste it off to the side like that. I prefer to do Control F because it stays right where it's supposed to be. We can turn that upside down like that. We can take this shape and then keep just these areas. And it's a little bit hard to see what this is actually doing, but if we give this a fill now, it'll make a little bit more sense. It's keeping just those. Then we have these triangles off around the outside like that. So again, there's a lot of stuff that you can do just building shapes and trying different things out with these primitive tools. We can add stars to this. Now, if I wanted to make a star, same thing with polygon. You can add points with the arrow keys. You can also, with the stars, if you hold the Control key, you can make the points longer or shorter. So we can add points like this. So we're essentially kind of getting this like six-pointed star both ways. We can make a six-pointed star in kind of two different ways here. I'm going to select all this stuff and then just align it to the center. Everything should be lined up like this. And then now I can take this again and I'll do minus front. Now, sometimes it'll give you weird stuff like this. And what's happened essentially is that it divided it based on whatever object was in the top here. This was actually a group of objects instead of one single object. Notice this is a bunch of separate triangles. And when you do an operation like this, it's only going to do the operation on this triangle down here because it's at the top of the stack. If you want to do an operation from Pathfinder, you actually need to get all of these to be a single object. So if we select this, we can go up to Object and go to Compound Path, Make. And it'll actually make those into one object that just has a bunch of different paths. And then we can select this stuff and do minus front, and we'll get something like that. Now, you can start kind of just stacking things up like this and doing a lot of different interesting things with shapes like this. I'm just going to drag this guy off to the side. So this is one way to work. Another way to work is to actually use text, and this is what I used in the demo. Is I just click once, add some text, and I'm literally typed in TXT. Now, one thing to be aware of with text boxes, if you click once and type your text in, you can get these little handles that will let you kind of scale this up. I am holding Shift to make sure it stays proportional. Otherwise, when you scale it up, it's going to be all squished like that. If instead you click and drag, which we're kind of used to with text boxes, but if you click and drag, you'll notice it fills it in with a bunch of stuff. Now, like if I go and size this, it sizes the text box instead of sizing the text itself. Whereas this one, since I just clicked once, it sizes the text and the box. Quick way to fix that is this little handle right here. It's a little kind of filled in circle. You notice when we select this one's filled in blue. When we select this one is empty. It's just white. So if we double click on this little guy right here, that will actually turn this into a little shape, just like this one, and vice versa here. If we double click on that, it'll turn this into a text box that we can scale up the box itself without scaling up the text. So just something to be aware of with text. I'm going to change this font. So this one, I already have a font that I'm going to be using, which is Balboa. And there's some tweaks that we need to make to this text in order to get it to work as a pattern. Now, right now, it's just editable text, but we can always take any text and basically just turn it into shapes. So we select our text, go to Object, and go to Expand. This will, I'm just going to leave these boxes checked, click OK. This will basically turn this into individual shapes. Now I can double click on this and go into the group and then move these around individually. But I'm just gonna, for the sake of simplicity, I'm gonna right click and ungroup this so it is no longer in a group. Now we've got these three shapes all separate in our layers panel. There are a couple of other things that I need to do, and if you look carefully at this X, you'll notice that this line on that goes kind of from top left to bottom right is a little bit thicker than the one that goes from top right to bottom left. And also, if you look at the T's, this little area here is just like very, very slightly smaller. So what I want to do is actually take this text and kind of make it nice and even. And a good way to do that is to cut it up with rectangles. So I'm just going to take a rectangle, and this X here, kind of move it to about there, drag this down, and I'm going to switch this foreground and background, and a quick way to do that is hold Shift and press X. Now you'll notice that when we do this, this one is snapped to the center down here, but not to the center up here. Ultimately, I'm going to be keeping the center at the top, so that's the one that I want to keep down here. So I'm going to keep that. We're going to select this X, we're going to do minus front. I'm going to do the same thing at the top, actually. So I'm going to take another rectangle, again, just bring it down to here. Step right there, just like this, do minus front. Oh, I'm sorry, I need to move this down. I put it in the wrong place here. I'm subtracting the wrong thing, so let's move that down. Just kind of up until it snaps at that little center point. So it does help to zoom in sometimes. Can get it to snap right there. There we go. Okay, so let's select both of those and then do minus front again. So I've really just kept this top left corner. What I'm going to do with that is I'm going to take this, I'm going to right click, transform, reflect, and preview it and see what it's actually going to do. Right now it's flipping it along the vertical axis, so I'm going to preview copy. When you click copy, it'll actually make a copy of that that's the same. So I'm going to just drag this over until it snaps. Now if it's not snapping, you might want to go to View and make sure that Smart Guides are turned on. Those should be turned on by default, but if it's not snapping, make sure those are turned on. I'm going to select both of those and then click Unite, so that's going to make one shape out of that. And then I'm just going to right click and transform, reflect again. And this time I'm going to reflect it across the horizontal axis. Copy it. You can already see what you get a lot of options for just kind of random cool shapes with letters. I take both of these and unite them. And with the T's, I really just need to flip the T across the center axis. Knowing what the center axis is a little bit tricky though. So I'm going to take this T. I'm actually only going to keep one of these. I'll get rid of that one. So I'm going to take this T here. I'm going to move it up a little bit. I'm just going to move it so it's centered right in the middle. That way I know with my box that I'm kind of snapping to the center of the document. There you go. So the box is snapping to the center of the document there. And I'm just going to do in minus front. Take this, transform, reflect. So I do want to change it to vertical, copy. So we can create all these kind of weird, interesting shapes. This is why I like breaking apart text, because we get a lot of kind of random cool shapes that we might not have thought of otherwise. Alright, so now I have this T. I'm just going to kind of place this next to the X. Now that T and X are slightly different heights. I'm going to go ahead and squish this down just a bit so they're both exactly the same height. There we go. Squish this down just a little bit more. I'm going to bring it back up. Kind of feel it out so we can get this so it's just snapping, and then this will give us kind of a random weird pattern. I also want to subtract out and kind of clean up some of these points. I don't need these extra points down here, so I'm going to hit the minus key on the keyboard. That'll take me to this delete anchor point tool. What I can do is just click on these extra anchor points to get rid of those. So you end up with extra anchor points. It's always good to kind of clean those out. So now I've got a T here, I've got an X here, and I'm just going to drag this T. Hold the Alt key and drag it over here. And if you hold Alt when you drag a shape, it'll actually make a copy of that shape, which is super handy. Alright, so let's just make sure it snaps to this top right, this top corner. Just having a bit of trouble getting it to snap there. This one doesn't look like it's snapped either. All right. So there's the basis of our pattern. I'm going to flip this one upside down though. So this is kind of the basis of the pattern I'm going to be using. I also want to make sure that this fits within a box, so I'm going to drag a square box to make sure that your box stays perfectly square. So I'm going to use the rectangle. Just hold the shift key. I'm dragging it from the top left corner like this, just down to where it meets the bottom of this. And this is almost square. Let me hold shift and hit X there to invert those, but it's not quite square. So see where this one is just hanging out over the edge a little bit. To make sure everything tiles correctly and that we have enough control over it, it makes it a little bit easier if we make sure everything is nice and square. That also helps us kind of implement our factorization system so that it doesn't kind of run off the document in weird ways. I'm going to select all three of the letters and just squish them in just slightly so that they fit within this perfectly square box. So now my whole pattern should be perfectly square. Now this I'm going to send to the back. I'm going to hold Control, Shift, and left bracket, and that will send it all the way to the back of the document stack. Let's go ahead and get rid of this because it's kind of getting in the way. So now it's going to send it down behind everything else. Alright, so this is my little setup here. Now we need to start defining colors for this. Since this is using the bezeled effect, bezeled effect works by swapping out one color for another. So say, for instance, you were limited to only 4 colors, you had a 4-color process. Color is expensive, and when you're printing, the more colors that you use, the more expensive the process gets, and it's quite expensive because you have to potentially make screens and everything. So a lot of times when you're making things, you want to try to make it with as few colors as possible. The bezeled effect allows us to use 4 colors but make very different color schemes and very different feels by just swapping out one color for another. In order for that to work, though, we need to be very kind of careful about where we place our colors and how many colors we use. I'm going to establish my kind of starting color here with the fill for this background. And we'll say something like this, really, really light green. I kind of want this to be like a really, really bright, like yellowy green, something like that. And then once I've established that color, I can go into my color guide and I can find a color harmony that will work with that. So I'm going to go to color guide, and right now this is set as the base color. If I click this little drop down, it'll give me a whole bunch of different options for other color harmonies. So there's split complementary and triad. Of the two, probably going to go ahead and go with triad. Ultimately, we're only going to be using 3 colors, so you could use one that has more than 3 colors if you wanted, like pentagram, for instance, but ultimately we're only going to be using the 3 and then swapping out 1. I'm going to go ahead and go with triad here because it gives me 3 colors, and then just kind of decide where the other colors are going to go. So we'll select these T's here and we'll give those a color. I'm going to select this X. I'm going to bring this all the way to the front, and then we'll give this orange color. Now, these are a little bit bright, and for the bezeled effect to work really well, you kind of need to have some that are darker. So you need a value change in there so that you can get a value contrast with the color that you swap. If you don't have a value contrast, it won't work quite as well. We can adjust, we can play with the way that we stack these. So we can bring this one to the front. So I'm just holding Control, Shift, and then right bracket. Or can do Control, left bracket, and just send it back one step at a time. I think I'm just going to go ahead and leave it like that. And it's like these here, though, because that blue, though, is just a little bit too light. We can kind of tweak this. I'm going to expand my color panel out here. So just like with the align panel, when you click on these little tiny arrows next to color, it'll expand it out into different formats. I could use the CMYK sliders on this and try to make it a little bit darker or lighter. I think I want these to be darker. I'm going to go ahead and do that. But if I start changing the hue a lot, it's going to change my color harmony. So I'm going to go back over here and just kind of reset this as the base. Let's go ahead and take these guys and then just apply that color there again. Instead of using the CMYK sliders, I just want to really kind of keep the same hue but just change the value of it. So a way to do that is to click this little hamburger menu at the top. We can go to different color mixers. So there's RGB and also HSB. what HSB is, gives us hue, saturation, and brightness. So hues like red, yellow, green, blue, etc. Saturation, how intense it is, so we can make this really intense, and brightness, so we can make it really dark. So I'm going to make it a little bit actually less intense, and also very, very dark, so it kind of gives it a little bit different feel there. I also want this kind of yellow-green background to just be a little bit more intense, and maybe also just a little bit brighter too, so it really stands out. And then finally this orange one, I'm going to go ahead and really crank up the intensity on that, and also the brightness. Alright, so we've got a pattern. This is going to create a pattern, but before we do that, we want to size it. I'm just going to take this and I'm going to group it so it treats all of them as one thing. If we don't group it, when we size it down, it's going to kind of act in a weird way. So we're going to go to transform, and it is grouped. And this is where our factors come in. So remember, with an A3 document, we do have to round up one of the numbers to 300 millimeters, but then we also have 420 millimeters in the long dimension. So with this, really 300 and 420 are going to give us factors like 60, 30, 20, 15, and that's going to be important to make sure that we don't have a pattern that kind of runs off in a weird way. I'm going to set this to 30 millimeters, and you can kind of play with different sizes, and of course you can always play with different sizes later. Now you'll notice it squished it by 30 that way. If you want to do both of them at the same time, just Control Z to undo, go to transform again, click this little chain link, and what it'll do is let you basically type in a number into either of these, and it will scale it down in both dimensions for you, which is kind of handy. Alright, so I've got my pattern down to 30. We might try it at 20 as well. See what it looks like at 20. That might be a little bit too small, but I guess we'll see. And once you're happy with your pattern tile, we can go to Object, go to Pattern, Make. What it'll do is it's going to add this pattern onto the swatches panel. So swatches contains colors, but it also contains patterns and gradients and other things. I'm just going to click OK. So later on when we want to edit it, what we're going to do is double click on that swatch. We can kind of see what it's doing. Now this isn't exactly what I was looking for, so we're going to need to tweak the way that this pattern is applied here. Right now it's using a grid, so we can do grid with a brick. That kind of changes things in an interesting way. We can do brick by column instead, so it'll kind of offset things in an interesting way. We can also change the size of the tile, and the tile is this little blue box that goes around it. Basically the tile is kind of how going to control the spacing of this. If we want to edit the tile, we can control the size here, but I find it's a little bit easier to actually just use this. So this pattern tile tool will actually let us scale it down dynamically. So we can take this edge. Oh, it said we can scale it down dynamically, and now it's not letting me do it. So we'll scale it down to there, just so it like snaps with that edge right there. And we end up with this kind of like stair-steppy woven kind of pattern, which is more interesting than it was before. And then we can also just change this by try like hex or hex by row. Neither of those really work with this pattern, so I'm going to just go back to my brick by column here. Okay, so there's my pattern, and the nice thing about this is that it's still completely editable. If we wanted to go to like a selection tool and we wanted to change or create additional objects in here, like I could just take this and go to a different color, it'll change all of the instances in the pattern for us, which is kind of handy. Also need to tweak this little guy here because it's just a little bit too big, or a little bit off. Getting some lines in there, so that should be alright. Let's check this one down here as well. And we'll just snap that. So you can really kind of tweak this and play with it until you get an effect that you like. I'm getting a lot of little artifacts in here, which I don't exactly want. So we do need to kind of clean this up a little bit because that's going to make it worse. Alright, so kind of tweak this. I'm going to bring this one in. a little bit too. And if you ever kind of get to a point with it where you're just like, well, this is weird, I don't like this, you can always go back to the original size by clicking this little box for size tile to art, and that will just set it back to the kind of perfect original dimensions. So with this one, I'm going to go ahead and drag this back in just a little bit. Now for the bezeled effect to work, you have to have all color. It can't have black or white in it. We see colors because, we see colors in relationship to each other, and so if you have colors that are touching a non-color, something that is achromatic like black or white, or an achromatic gray, the effect is going to break and it's not going to work. So with the bezeled effects, you have to have all three colors. You can't have any black or white. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and just exit out of this. So to get out of this, I'm going to go back to my main selection and then just double click. And then we can take this tile and just kind of put it off to the side over here. We're not going to need it. And I'm going to create a new rectangle that's just going to fill the entire space here. And I can click on that and it will apply that pattern. So this is kind of a crazy bright pattern here. I'm going to go ahead and change this. So what I'm going to do is essentially drag out a copy of this. I'm going to hold Alt and just drag this over here. And I'm also going to duplicate this pattern. So I'm going to take the pattern, I'm just going to click and drag down here onto this new button, and you'll notice that it's created a new pattern for me. Now both of these still have the same swatch applied, but this one I'm going to go ahead and apply this swatch. We don't see any change yet, but now if I double click on this, we get our swatch right here. So what I'm going to do is just drag a box around all the art here. I'm going to go up to Edit, go to Edit Colors, and go to Recolor Artwork. And what this will let us do is basically just swap out one of these colors for something else. So what I'm going to swap out is this orange. I'm going to take that and swap it for a nice cool color, something that's a little bit more calming and kind of the opposite effect of that really bright, intense orange. And also the opposite value. So the orange is really, really bright and really, really intense. So what I'm going to go for is something that's kind of, instead of being really warm, bright, and intense, I'm going to make it cool, dark, and kind of less intense, more of a gray. Kind of a low intensity blue here. So click OK. You can see that that completely changes the feel of this. And I'm actually going to make it just a little bit darker, I think. So if I double click on this, we can tweak it just a little bit more. Make this the darkest color in the setup. So something really, really dark like that. Let's make it a little bit more blue. Instead of blue-green. Alright. So now when I click OK, and just double click to get out of this, now we've got two different patterns. So what we did was change one color, but you can see that the feel of these patterns is much, much different. I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it on top of this other pattern. So this is where the bezeled effect can come in a design. I'm going to go ahead and design something, so I could actually maybe use this. This is a little bit small, but this will kind of illustrate the effect that we're going to go for. But I'm just going to put this right in the center. We'll scale it up a little bit, and I'm going to put it on top of the rectangle, so over the rectangle. So I've got my rectangle with the pattern. I've got my fill group here. Select both of those, and I'm going to go up to Object, Clipping Mask, Make. And you can see it didn't quite work because that is like too many different shapes. They're all individual shapes. So what we need to do is make sure that this is a single thing. Right now it's a group, so I'm going to go to Object, Compound Path, Make, so it turns it into one thing again. Again, make sure it's on top of this stuff. I think I stepped back too many times there. We'll scale it up a little bit, select both of these, and I'm going to go back to Object, Clipping Mask, Make. So now we can see what it's doing. It's basically poking a hole in this, or it's poking a hole everywhere where this kind of clipping mask isn't. If I drag this over here, you can see what's left is just this little bit of that pattern. Now if we're not happy with that, we can always do a different clipping mask. So I'm just going to move this guy out of the way. And we can try all sorts of different things. So we can try our ellipse tool. I'm just going to drag out a couple of ellipses here. Let's go ahead and make these. I'm going to do this way. I'm going to make these just white and or black for now. And so there's one. I'm going to duplicate this, Control C, Control F. I'll scale it down a little bit. And I'm holding Shift and Alt when I scale this down to make sure that it scales to the center. If you don't hold Alt, you just hold Shift, it's going to scale to the top left corner. I've never found that helpful. I don't know why that's the default, but it is. This one I'm going to make it black, and we can kind of see where this is going. I'm going to put this like this. I can make kind of a little face here. I'm just going to make a little. So with my pen tool, click and drag spacebar to move a point while you're dragging it out, something like that. And I'm just going to hit V to kind of exit out of this. V drops the pen tool and jumps back to our selection tool. I'm going to switch this over so it's just a stroke. So I'm going to get rid of that fill, and I'm going to make this stroke really, really thick. So to get to that quickly, I'm just going to deselect and then select it again, and now we get all these controls up here. So I'm going to give this a really, really thick stroke. We can also get to those controls from the stroke panel and some additional controls too. So again, same thing, Illustrator likes to collapse stuff on us. But if I go over here to the stroke panel, click those little buttons, it'll expand out. So now we can change the way this looks. We can add a rounded cap on the ends. And I'm going to go ahead and make it just a little bit thicker. Maybe a little bit too thick. Let's take it back down. Okay. Now for this to work, it needs to be a shape. And right now it's just a line. It's not like a shape like this is an enclosed path. If we look at this, this little blue line goes all the way around. With this one, the blue line it's a straight line and then it has a stroke. Strokes don't mask anything out by themselves. They need to be applied as a shape. So in order for this to work with a clipping mask, we're going to need to do some cleanup on this. First thing I'm going to do is take that line, I'm going to go up to Object, and just like I did with the text before, I'm going to expand. Just click OK, and see now it's turned it into a shape where we have that line going all the way around. I'm also going to take these little eyeballs here and the black pupil and the white around it, and I'm going to do minus front, so the black pupil kind of becomes a hole that's knocked in it. Same thing with this one, minus front. I'm going to take this shape, and this shape, and I want to turn those into one thing. So in my layers, they need to be a single object. Right now, they're kind of a bunch of things, like a group and two other objects. So just like before, objects, compound path, make, and then we'll turn it into one thing and it'll apply the same style. So we get rid of the black there. So now it's just all white with one fill around it, and over here in our panel, it is one single object. Now if I drag this down a little bit, we can put this over top of our rectangle. Shift select them both. And actually the clipping mask, the hotkey is Control 7. So now we've got this little face that we can kind of knock into our pattern. So we can kind of create these really, really crazy effects by knocking holes into other patterns and just revealing the darkest on top of this lighter pattern. One thing to keep in mind with patterns is that as we move this around, you'll notice that the pattern stays in place. The pattern doesn't move around with it, so we can move this rectangle around wherever we want it, and it will stay in place. We can also go into this here, and if we wanted to tweak something, we can expand this out, and we can actually select these shapes later inside of this. It's a little bit difficult to do it from the Layers panel, though, so what I'd recommend is double-click on it. And now you're going to enter into isolation mode. Now, in isolation mode, we're still, like, this is treated as one big thing, but we can actually enter isolation mode another level deeper by double-clicking again. And so now we're at the level where we're actually editing this compound path itself. So all the different shapes or all the different pieces that make up that compound path, we can actually edit individually. So I'm going to make these just a little bit bigger. The pupils, one really big and one is a little bit smaller. Put them off to the side. Okay, actually, let's bring that in just a little bit. Double click to get out of it, and you can see that it's kind of changed the way that works. Now, I drag this one out a little bit too far, and you can see with a compound path, you run into some weird issues with things like that. So you want to make sure that it doesn't kind of go outside of it. I'm going to double click on this again, double click again, select, just kind of move it back in a little bit. Now there's a little bit more flexible way of working with these, and that's to use a transparency mask. There's one last way that we'll look at. I'm just going to duplicate this here. I'm going to Control-C and copy and just paste it outside of this. So I pasted these. Let's just move this back over into the center and align like that. Now with the transparency mask, this works in a little bit different way, but it's a little bit more flexible. So with transparency, open the transparency panel, and you'll notice that we've got blend modes, just like we would in Photoshop. You have opacity, just like we would in Photoshop. And we've got these two little boxes right here. Right now, we don't have a mask, but we can make a mask. So I'm going to click Make a Mask. By default, it hides everything. And let's go ahead and hide this clip group. And you'll notice this turns black when we do this. When you first create it, the default is to just make it white, and then you like reveal everything. What we want to do is actually the opposite of that. So we're going to hide everything and then just reveal it so it kind of behaves the same way that the clipping mask does. So I can draw out shapes here. Now, when you draw out your shape, you want to make sure that you have either black or white fill. Now, here, if we set to black, I'm not editing the mask, I'm just like... I'm not even working on the actual mask. Before you edit the mask, you actually have to click on this little box right here. So click on the box. Now, anything that I draw on there, you'll notice too that our layers change. When we click on this, we've got a kind of totally different layer set up that is just on this mask layer. I'm going to drag out a box, and we'll change this. We'll set this as white. So white is going to make this opaque, and black is going to make it transparent, which is already transparent. And anything that's kind of like gray in the middle is going to make it kind of semi-transparent. I'm going to set it up to be white, so we can just see through it completely. I can add additional shapes, so Control-C, Control-F to make a copy of the circle. We'll bring that back up here. I'm going to make that black so we can see through it. This now works in a little bit more flexible way than the other one did. So now I can take this whole thing here, we'll move that over, duplicate, rotate. You can also do a lot of things like grouping and stuff that we can't do with a clipping mask. So with the transparency mask, we have a lot more flexibility. And same thing that I did before, I'm just going to use the pen tool. This one will give him a little happy face though. Spacebar, and I know it's a little bit hard to look at this while we're looking at the this pattern. I'm going to switch these and give it this like crazy stroke again. Let's give it a white stroke so it actually works. Expand this out, give it rounded caps on the ends, increase the thickness a little bit. And then you can kind of create really whatever design you want in this. The nice thing with transparency is that again, it's a little bit more flexible, so there's a lot of stuff that we can do with it. We can also kind of grab all these guys and move them around, group them, flip them, rotate them, etc. So we've got a lot of flexibility with this. Now, it's important when you're done editing your mask that you exit out of it, otherwise we can't get to anything else. So if I open my layers here, I can't see any of the other objects that I could see before, so I actually have to make sure transparency is open and click off of that mask to get out of there. So when we click back, now we can get back to all of our other stuff. I'm going to go ahead and delete the rest of this, and you can even delete the things that you used to make the mask and everything will stay there. And that's it. Now we're ready to print out our super bright bezeled effect pattern. So I hope that's been helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.